A millionaire invited his black ex to his wedding to humiliate her. But she had a secret identity. The envelope arrived at exactly 6:23 p.m. on a Tuesday. And Naomi knew it wasn't casual correspondence. Not because of the expensive cream cardstock or the gold-embossed return address, but because of the way her hands trembled when she recognized the handwriting. She stood frozen in the doorway of her minimalist Manhattan apartment, still wearing her blazer from work, staring at her name written in Logan Whitmore's precise, calculated script. Her pulse quickened as she stepped inside, closing the door behind her with deliberate care. She didn't open it right away. Instead, she set it on the kitchen counter and stared at it like it might detonate. The silence in her apartment felt suffocating, pressing against her temples. Finally, with steady fingers that betrayed none of the chaos in her chest, she slid her thumb under the seal. Logan Whitmore and Emily Davenport request the honor of your presence. The words blurred. Naomi's breath caught. A wedding invitation. Not just any wedding invitation. His wedding invitation. To her. The ex-girlfriend he'd discarded 8 months ago without explanation, without closure, without even the dignity of a proper goodbye. She gripped the edge of the counter, her knuckles tight against the marble. He was marrying Emily Davenport. Of course he was. Everyone who followed society pages knew who Emily Davenport was. The polished heiress with the perfect pedigree, the country club smile, the kind of old-money elegance that opened doors Logan had spent his entire life trying to break down. She was everything Naomi had refused to perform for him. Traditional where Naomi was independent. Connected where Naomi had deliberately kept her world small and private. Acceptable where Naomi, with her brown skin and her refusal to shrink herself, had apparently been nothing more than a phase. But it was the handwritten note tucked inside that made her stomach turn. Naomi, I hope you'll come. I think it would show everyone that we've both moved on. That there are no hard feelings. It would mean a lot to me, and to Emily, to have you there. Logan. Naomi read it 3 times. Each time, the subtext became clearer. He wanted her there to perform. To sit quietly in a pew and watch him ascend to the life he'd always wanted, the life she'd never fit into. He wanted her humiliation to be the final ornament on his trophy case of success. If you're ready to enjoy this story, click that subscribe button, like this video and comment where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring more wonderful stories, and trust me, you won't want to miss them. Now let's get into the story. She set the invitation down and walked to her bedroom. The apartment suddenly felt different. Smaller, like the walls were closing in with the weight of Logan's arrogance. She opened her closet, pushing past the neutral work blazers and simple dresses she wore to blend in, to move through the world unnoticed. At the very back, wrapped in protective fabric, hung a garment she hadn't worn in over a year. Deep sapphire blue. Gold embroidery along the edges. She pulled it out slowly, running her fingers over the intricate patterns that told a story most people in this city would never understand. Naomi stood there for a long moment, holding the dress, her mind racing through every conversation with Logan, every moment she'd held back the truth about who she really was. He'd asked once, half joking over wine at some overpriced restaurant, "What's your family like? You never talk about them. What are you, secretly royalty or something?" She'd smiled. Said her family was private. Changed the subject. He'd never asked again. Never cared enough to dig deeper. And when she'd told him she needed to return to Nigeria for family obligations, he'd grown distant, cold. 2 weeks later, he'd stopped returning her calls. A month after that, she'd seen his engagement announcement to Emily in the society pages. Now, standing in her apartment with his wedding invitation mocking her from the counter, Naomi made a decision. She carefully laid the sapphire dress on her bed. She would go to Logan Whitmore's wedding. But not as the heartbroken ex he expected. not as the woman meant to prove his upward climb. She would go as herself, fully, completely, for the first time since she'd arrived in America. She pulled out her phone and typed a single message to her brother. "Elias, I need you in New York. It's time." The response came within seconds. "I'll be on the next flight." "What do you need?" Naomi looked at the invitation one more time, at Logan's smug little note, at the date circled in gold. 3 weeks. She had 3 weeks. "Bring the crown," she typed back. "And the guards. I'm done hiding." She hit send and set the phone down. For the first time in 8 months, since Logan had made her feel small and disposable, Naomi smiled. Not a bitter smile. Not a smile of revenge. But a smile of clarity. Logan Whitmore thought he was inviting an ex-girlfriend to witness his triumph. What he didn't know, what he'd never bothered to discover, was that he was inviting Princess Naomi Carter-Adebayo of the Kingdom of Okaforia. And she was about to teach him that some women don't need closure. They need only to reveal who they've always been. To understand what Naomi was about to do, you have to understand what Logan never knew. You have to go back to a year earlier, to the beginning, when a woman who could have revealed her crown chose instead to see if a man could love her without it. They met at a charity gala in September. Naomi had been there representing a non-profit she quietly funded, standing near the bar in a simple black dress that cost a fraction of what the other women wore. Logan had approached with that smile, the one he'd perfected in front of mirrors, the one that said he knew exactly how handsome he was and expected her to notice. "You look like the only person here who isn't trying too hard," he'd said, leaning against the bar with calculated casualness. Naomi had laughed. Not because the line was good, but because it was so transparently rehearsed. "That's quite an opening. I'm Logan." He'd extended his hand. Logan Whitmore. He'd said his name like it should mean something. Like she should recognize it from society pages or business journals. She didn't. Or rather, she did. She'd done her research on everyone at the gala. But she let him believe she was impressed rather than informed. "Naomi," she'd said simply, shaking his hand. "Just Naomi?" He'd grinned. "No last name. Are you a spy or something?" "Something like that." She'd smiled, sipped her wine, and watched him work to decode her. That was how it began. With her mystery and his fascination with solving it. The first month was a montage of carefully curated moments. Dinner at a rooftop restaurant in Tribeca where Logan knew the owner and made sure she saw him being recognized. Cocktails at an exclusive lounge where he casually mentioned his family's real estate portfolio. A weekend in the Hamptons at a friend's beach house where he introduced her to people with hyphenated last names and old money. Logan had charm the way some men have cologne, applied liberally, designed to intoxicate, but ultimately surface level. He would open doors and pull out chairs, ask questions about her work with attentive eyes, laugh at her observations about the city. But Naomi noticed something early. He listened only until he could redirect the conversation back to himself. "You're so grounded," he'd said once, over Thai food in the East Village. "So real. Everyone I meet is trying to impress me or use me for connections. But you," he'd reached across the table to touch her hand. "You're different." Different. She'd heard that word before. It was never a compliment, not really. It was a category. A box labeled exotic enough to intrigue, safe enough to date, temporary enough to leave. "What about your family?" Logan had asked one night, 3 months in, lying in bed in her apartment. "You never talk about them." Naomi had been tracing patterns on his chest, her mind half elsewhere. "They're private." "Private how?" "Just, we keep to ourselves." Logan had propped himself up on one elbow, studying her face. "Come on. Give me something. Brothers? Sisters? Are your parents still together?" She'd smiled, non-committal. I have a brother. My parents passed when I was young. I'm sorry. He'd kissed her forehead. Then, after a beat, where's your brother now? Africa. Africa's a big place. Nigeria. Logan had nodded like he understood, but his eyes had already glazed over slightly. Africa was a story for cocktail parties, a conversation piece, not a real place with real complexity. She could see him filing the information away under interesting background details rather than fundamental truths about the woman I'm dating. But he never asked more. Never asked about her childhood, about why she'd come to America, about the way she moved through the world with a posture that suggested training most people never received. He saw her as grounded. His word, always his word, but never asked what had grounded her. Never wondered if perhaps she wasn't anchored to the earth but rather choosing not to fly. The cracks started showing around month 5. Logan began mentioning his parents more frequently. Their expectations, their circle. His mother had started asking about Naomi. When would he bring her to the family estate? When would they make things official? She's very traditional, Logan had said, something apologetic in his voice. She has ideas about who I should end up with. Naomi had understood perfectly. She just hadn't expected him to say it out loud. What kind of ideas? She'd asked, her voice level. You know. He'd waved his hand vaguely. Old money stuff. Family background. The usual social politics. The usual social politics. A sanitized way of saying, you're black and she's not ready for that. Naomi had said nothing. She'd filed it away alongside all the other small cuts, the time he'd called her hair interesting when she wore it natural, the way he always chose restaurants in neighborhoods where they were unlikely to run into his parents, the subtle surprise in his voice when she understood references to classical music or European history. He wanted her to be grounded. Exotic. Different. But not too different. Never equal. Then came the phone call in February. Naomi's aunt, her mother's sister, one of the few people who knew the truth of Naomi's life, had called from Okaforia. Her brother needed her. There were matters of state, decisions to be made, a role she could no longer avoid. I have to go back to Nigeria, Naomi had told Logan over dinner at yet another trendy restaurant. Family obligations. Logan had set down his fork, something flickering across his face. Annoyance. Inconvenience. For how long? A few weeks. Maybe longer. Can't your brother handle it? Logan had asked. I thought you said he was there. It's complicated. Everything with your family seems complicated. He'd smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. You're so secretive about them. What are you, royalty or something? The question had hung in the air between them, half joke, half accusation. Naomi had looked at him across the table. This man she'd spent 7 months with, this man who'd touched her skin but never bothered to see beneath it, and made a choice. She'd smiled. Something like that. Logan had laughed. Right. Princess Naomi. I can see it. But he couldn't. That was the problem. He'd never seen anything except what he wanted to see. Naomi had left for Nigeria 2 days later. She'd texted Logan from the airport. Called him once from Okaforia. He'd responded with brief messages. Distracted. Then the messages stopped. No call. No explanation. Just silence stretching across continents. When she'd returned 3 weeks later, Logan's social media had told her everything she needed to know. Pictures at galas. Pictures at charity events. Pictures with a blonde woman who looked like she'd stepped out of a Ralph Lauren ad. Emily Davenport. 2 weeks after that, his number went straight to voicemail. He never said goodbye. Never acknowledged what they'd had. He simply erased her and moved on to someone who fit better into his carefully curated life. Naomi had sat in her apartment then, much like she sat now, and felt the rage crystallize into something cold and sharp in her chest. She'd buried it, pushed it down, told herself it didn't matter, that he'd done her a favor, that she was better off. She'd almost convinced herself. Until now. The Whitmore estate wore its wealth like armor. 300 acres of manicured lawns rolled toward a Georgian mansion that had been in the family for 4 generations, its white columns gleaming in the late afternoon sun. Valets in crisp uniforms guided luxury cars up the circular drive while guests emerged in clouds of expensive perfume and designer labels. Champagne flutes caught the light. Laughter floated across the garden like it had been choreographed. Inside the grand ballroom, crystal chandeliers dripped from 20-foot ceilings. White roses and peonies spilled from towering arrangements positioned between rows of ivory chairs tied with silk ribbons. A string quartet played Vivaldi near the altar, where an arch wrapped in more flowers framed the space where Logan Whitmore would claim his prize. In the groom's suite upstairs, Logan stood before a full-length mirror, adjusting his cufflinks for the 3rd time. The tuxedo had been custom-made in Milan, fitted to emphasize his athletic build. His hair was perfect. His smile was perfect. Everything about this day was perfect. "You look like you're about to accept an Oscar," Marcus, his best man, said from the leather sofa, drink in hand. "Not get married." Logan grinned, catching Marcus's eye in the mirror. "Same thing, isn't it? Performance of a lifetime." "Jesus, Logan." Marcus laughed. "Don't let Emily hear you say that. Emily knows what this is." Logan turned from the mirror, reaching for his own glass of scotch. "This is about legacy. Building something that matters. She gets it." Marcus swirled his drink, something thoughtful crossing his face. "Speaking of people who might not get it, you sure it was a good idea to invite Naomi?" Logan's smile didn't falter. If anything, it sharpened. "It was a great idea. Most guys don't invite their exes to their weddings, man. Especially when the breakup was." Marcus paused, searching for the word. Abrupt. "It'll be good for her." Logan took a long sip of scotch, savoring the burn. "She can see how far I've come. That I've moved on to someone who actually fits my life. It's closure. It's mature. It's something," Marcus muttered. Logan walked to the window overlooking the lawn where guests mingled beneath white tents. He could see his mother holding court near the champagne fountain, his father working the crowd with practiced ease, the society photographers capturing every carefully orchestrated moment. "This is what matters," Logan said quietly, more to himself than to Marcus. "This right here. This is what success looks like." 3 doors down, Emily Davenport stood in front of her own mirror, a team of attendants fussing over the train of her lace gown. She looked like a bride from a magazine spread. Blonde hair swept into an elegant updo, makeup flawless, the dress a masterpiece of French lace and silk that had taken 8 months to create. "You're stunning," her maid of honor breathed. Emily practiced her smile, the one she'd been rehearsing for weeks. Gracious but not too eager. Elegant but not cold. The perfect blend of old money confidence and new bride joy. "Is everything ready?" Emily asked, her voice controlled. "Everything's perfect. The guests are arriving. Logan's waiting. It's all exactly as planned." Emily nodded, studying her reflection. This was what she'd been raised for. The perfect marriage to the perfect man with the perfect future. Logan Whitmore was ambitious, handsome, hungry for the status her name would give him. And she would finally step out of her sister's shadows and into a spotlight of her own. "There was one thing," her maid of honor said hesitantly. "I saw on the seating chart that Logan invited an ex-girlfriend?" Emily's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Naomi something. Yes, I know. That doesn't bother you. Why would it? Emily smoothed her dress. She's nobody. Logan said she'd barely show, but if she does, it'll just prove how far he's risen above that phase of his life. That phase. Emily had heard the story. Logan's brief relationship with some woman he'd met at a charity event. Pretty enough, Logan had said dismissively, but not the kind of woman you build a future with. Not like Emily. Let's go, Emily said, lifting her chin. Time to make an entrance. The ceremony was set to begin at 5 o'clock. At 4:47, most guests had taken their seats. The murmur of conversation filled the ballroom. Gossip about mergers, vacation homes, whose children had gotten into which Ivy League schools. At 4:52, Logan took his place at the altar, Marcus beside him. Logan scanned the crowd, noting who had come, who mattered, who was watching him claim his victory. At 4:55, the string quartet shifted into the processional music. At 4:56, everything changed. The massive doors at the back of the ballroom opened. Not slowly, not tentatively, but with deliberate grace. And Naomi Carter-Adebayo walked through them. The effect was immediate. Conversations died mid-sentence. Heads turned. Someone gasped. She wore a gown the color of deep sapphire, almost midnight blue, that seemed to absorb and reflect light simultaneously. The fabric moved like water, cut perfectly to her frame, with gold embroidery tracing intricate patterns along the neckline and hem. But it wasn't the dress that commanded attention. It was her. Naomi walked with her head high, her posture regal, her expression serene but unreadable. She didn't hurry. She didn't hesitate. She moved down the center aisle with the kind of presence that made people instinctively stand straighter, that made the room itself seem to reorganize around her. And she wasn't alone. Two men flanked her, tall and imposing in perfectly tailored black suits. They moved in synchronized silence, their bearing military precise. They weren't bodyguards trying to blend in. They were protection making a statement. Logan's smile froze on his face. His fingers gripped the edge of the altar. This wasn't the Naomi he remembered, the soft-spoken woman in simple dresses who laughed at his jokes and made him feel smart. This was someone else entirely. Or perhaps this was who she'd always been, and he'd simply never bothered to look. Emily, waiting with her bridesmaids in the side corridor, peeked through the doorway at the commotion. Her breath caught. She watched Logan's face, watched the way his jaw twitched, the way color rose to his cheeks. "Who is that?" Emily whispered. "That's the ex," her maid of honor breathed. "That's Naomi." Naomi reached the fourth row, far closer to the front than most exes would dare sit, and took her seat with fluid grace. The men flanking her remained standing for a moment longer, scanning the room with professional detachment before taking positions at either end of her row. The whispers started immediately, spreading through the guests like wildfire. "Who is she?" "Logan's ex, but look at her. Those men with her, are they security? She looks like. Is she someone important?" At the altar, Marcus leaned close to Logan. "Man, who the hell is that?" Logan couldn't answer. His throat had gone dry. Because the woman sitting calmly in the fourth row, nodding politely to the guests around her, bore no resemblance to the woman he'd ghosted 8 months ago. That Naomi had been containable. Forgettable. Someone he could leave behind as he climbed higher. This Naomi looked like she'd never needed him to climb anywhere at all. And in the corridor, Emily gripped her bouquet tighter, watching Logan's face, and felt the first cold whisper of doubt slide down her spine. The processional music swelled. Emily's bridesmaids began their choreographed walk down the aisle, each step timed to the strings. Logan forced his eyes forward, away from the fourth row where Naomi sat with the stillness of a statue. her hands folded in her lap. But he could feel her presence the way you feel a storm building on the horizon. Inevitable, electric, dangerous. The whispers hadn't stopped. They rippled through the rows of guests like wind through wheat, hushed but persistent. Did you see her entrance? Those men, they look like Secret Service. I heard she and Logan dated, but this seems. She doesn't look like someone who got left behind. Emily appeared at the ballroom entrance, backlit by the late afternoon sun streaming through the glass doors. She looked perfect, every inch the bride Logan was supposed to want. The guests rose in a wave of rustling silk and admiration. The photographer moved into position. This was the moment Emily had dreamed of, planned for, rehearsed in mirrors since she was a girl. But as she began her walk down the aisle, her eyes found Logan's face. And then, betraying every ounce of bridal composure she'd practiced, her gaze slid to the fourth row. To Naomi. Emily's step faltered. Barely, just a fraction of a second, but enough that her father squeezed her arm in question. She recovered, forced her pageant smile back into place, and continued walking. But something in her chest had shifted, tightened. She'd expected the ex-girlfriend to look diminished, uncomfortable, maybe defiant in an awkward, trying too hard way. But Naomi looked like she belonged in this ballroom more than Emily did. Like she'd graced 100 rooms exactly like this and found them all slightly beneath her. Who is she? 20 years earlier. Lagos, Nigeria. An 8-year-old girl with serious eyes sat in a palace courtyard, her back rigid, while her aunt adjusted her posture with a gentle but firm hand. Shoulders back, Naomi. You carry the weight of lineage in your spine. But I don't want to be a princess, the girl whispered. I want to be normal. Her aunt, regal, patient, uncompromising, knelt before her. You are both. And that is your burden and your gift. One day you'll understand. Naomi's fingers traced the edge of the envelope in her lap. Cream-colored, sealed, addressed to 3 major media outlets and 2 international news agencies. Inside were documents she'd spent the last 3 weeks preparing with her legal team. Verified lineage charts, diplomatic credentials, photographs that would make Logan's society pages look like child's play. She didn't want to use it. But she would if necessary. The envelope was insurance. A silken blade she hoped to keep sheathed. The officiant began speaking, his voice rich with practiced solemnity. Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today. Logan's hands clasped in front of him, knuckles white. He still hadn't looked at Naomi directly, but his body angled slightly away from the fourth row, as if creating distance could diminish her presence. It couldn't. 15 years earlier. A government building in Abuja. A 13-year-old Naomi sat outside a conference room, schoolbooks in her lap, while inside her brother, barely 18 but already commanding respect, negotiated with ministry officials. When the door opened and the men emerged, they bowed slightly to her. Not out of condescension to a child. Out of protocol. Her brother had found her afterward, exhausted but smiling. Did you finish your homework? Did you finish changing policy? She'd countered. We're working on it. He'd ruffled her hair. You won't always be able to hide behind textbooks, you know. Eventually, they'll want you at the table. I don't want the table. I want to choose my own life. Elias had grown serious then. Then go. Build that life. But know that when you're ready, when you're needed, the crown doesn't forget its daughters. Emily reached the altar. Her father kissed her cheek and stepped back. She took Logan's hands, trying to focus on his face, on the moment she'd orchestrated down to the flower arrangements. But she could feel the attention in the room splitting, fracturing. Half the guests were watching her. The other half kept glancing toward the fourth row. Marriage is a sacred bond, the officiant continued. built on trust, honesty, and the joining of two souls. Logan's jaw twitched. A bead of sweat appeared at his temple despite the carefully controlled climate. Naomi sat motionless, her expression serene, but her thumb pressed against the envelope seal, feeling the slight give of the adhesive beneath. One phone call. One release to the press pool waiting outside. That's all it would take. But not yet. 8 years earlier. New York City. Columbia University. Naomi walked across the graduation stage in her cap and gown, accepting her diploma in international relations with honors. In the audience, her aunt and brother sat in the middle row. Not the front, never the front. Always visible but never conspicuous. Afterward, her aunt had taken her hands. You've built a beautiful life here. You can stay. Continue as you are. No one will force you home. But, Naomi had asked, knowing there was more. But hiding who you are will always cost you something. Perhaps the question is not whether you're ready to be a princess. Perhaps it's whether you're ready to stop pretending you're not. Naomi had looked out at the New York skyline. Her adopted home, her chosen city. I'm not ready yet. Then we'll wait. But remember, you can only split yourself in two for so long before you must choose which half is real. The officiant reached the vows. Do you, Logan Michael Whitmore, take Emily Catherine Davenport to be your lawfully wedded wife? Logan's voice came out stronger than Naomi expected. I do. Several guests in Naomi's row leaned together, whispering. One woman pulled out her phone subtly, trying to search something. Her companion's eyes widened at whatever appeared on the screen. The whispers grew louder. Emily heard them. Her practiced smile wavered. Do you, Emily Catherine Davenport? The ballroom doors opened again. Not the main doors Naomi had entered through. The side doors, reserved for staff and service entrances. The officiant paused mid-sentence. Guests turned. Even Logan and Emily looked. 4 more men entered. Same black suits. Same military bearing. They took positions along the walls, not threatening but unmistakably present. Official. One of them caught Naomi's eye and gave the smallest nod. Her brother had arrived. Naomi's expression didn't change, but something in her posture shifted. Settled. The waiting was over. She stood. The movement was fluid, unhurried, but it cut through the ceremony like a knife through silk. Every eye in the ballroom turned to her. The officiant stopped speaking. Emily's breath caught audibly. Logan's face drained of color. I apologize for the interruption, Naomi said, her voice clear and carrying without effort, trained for exactly this kind of moment. But there's something that needs to be said before these vows are completed. Her hand left the envelope and rose to her side. The men along the walls straightened further. My name, Naomi continued, her eyes finally meeting Logan's across the altar, is Princess Naomi Carter-Adebayo of the Kingdom of Okaforia. Silence crashed through the ballroom like a physical force. And I believe we need to have a conversation about respect. The silence that followed Naomi's declaration lasted exactly 3 seconds. 3 seconds in which the entire room seemed to forget how to breathe, how to move, how to process what they just heard. Then the chaos erupted in whispers. Did she say princess? Okaforia, where is that? Is this some kind of joke? Logan's face transformed from shock to anger in the span of a heartbeat. He took a step forward, away from Emily, his hands clenched at his sides. What the hell are you doing? He hissed, loud enough for the first few rows to hear. This is my wedding. Your wedding, Naomi interrupted, her voice cutting through his indignation like steel through butter. That you invited me to. Or did you forget the note you sent? The one where you asked me to come witness your triumph. Emily grabbed Logan's arm, her perfect composure shattering. "Logan, what is happening?" But Naomi wasn't looking at either of them anymore. She turned to address the room, her voice carrying with the kind of projection that comes from years of speaking to assembled crowds, to councils, to rooms full of people who hung on every word. "I have not come to interrupt a wedding," Naomi said, her tone measured but absolute. "I have come to reclaim my name. For 8 months, I allowed Logan Whitmore to believe he had discarded someone insignificant. Someone who would quietly disappear from his narrative while he ascended to greater things." The guests were transfixed. Even the photographer had lowered his camera, watching. "But I am not insignificant. I never was." Naomi's eyes swept across the crowd, past the society matrons in their pearls, past the business magnates in their Italian suits, past every person who had ever made assumptions about who belonged in rooms like this. "I am Princess Naomi Carter-Adebayo, daughter of the late Crown Princess Adebayo of Okaforia, niece to the Queen Mother, and sister to the reigning sovereign." More gasps. Someone pulled out their phone. Marcus, still standing beside Logan at the altar, looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. Logan's face had gone from pale to red. "This is insane. You never. I never told you." Naomi's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "You never asked Logan." "Not really. You asked if I was royalty once as a joke, and when I didn't laugh, you moved on. You never wanted to know who I truly was. You wanted me to be convenient, digestible, small enough to fit into your world without disrupting it." The main ballroom doors, the grand ones at the entrance, swung open. Every head turned. The men who entered first were different from the ones already positioned along the walls. These wore formal military dress, black uniforms with gold braiding, medals catching the chandelier light, their bearing so precise they seemed to move as one organism. They formed 2 lines, creating a corridor from the door to where Naomi stood. And then he entered. King Elias Okafor was 33 years old, but he carried himself with the gravity of someone who'd been born understanding the weight of a crown. He stood 6'3", his frame athletic beneath the ceremonial regalia. Black robes edged in gold, traditional fabric draped with modern tailoring that spoke of a kingdom honoring its past while embracing its future. But it was the crown that made people's breath catch. Not ornate or gaudy, but unmistakable. Gold worked in intricate geometric patterns that echoed traditional Okaforia design, set with stones that caught and threw light like captured stars. He moved down the aisle, the same aisle Emily had walked minutes ago, with unhurried confidence. His eyes scanned the room, assessing, measuring, noting every face, every reaction. When his gaze landed on Logan, something flickered there. Not anger. Something colder. Dismissal. Naomi stepped into the aisle to meet him. When she reached his side, she executed a small bow, not subservient, but respectful, the acknowledgement of one royal to another. Elias's hand came to rest briefly on her shoulder, a gesture both protective and affirming. Then he spoke. His voice was deep, accented with the melodic cadence of someone who spoke multiple languages fluently, weighted with authority that came from 10 years of rule. "I am King Elias Okafor of the Kingdom of Okaforia." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The room had gone so quiet that even breathing seemed loud. "I have come to stand with my sister as she reclaims the dignity that should never have been questioned." One by one, guests began to rise from their seats. Not out of confusion or shock now, but out of instinct, the kind of instinct that recognizes power when it walks into a room. First the older guests, those who understood protocol. Then the younger ones, unsure but following the lead of their elders. Within 30 seconds, the entire ballroom was standing. All except Logan and Emily, frozen at the altar like mannequins in a tableau that had spiraled beyond their control. Emily's mother, seated in the front row, rose slowly, her hand pressed to her chest. She'd spent 40 years navigating society politics, and Naomi could see the calculation happening behind her eyes. This wasn't just an ex-girlfriend causing drama. This was a sovereign ruler attending a private wedding. This was international. "Your Majesty," Emily's mother said, her voice trembling slightly as she attempted a curtsy she'd probably learned in finishing school decades ago. Elias inclined his head in acknowledgement, gracious but not familiar. Logan finally found his voice, though it came out strangled. This is my wedding." "This was your wedding," Naomi said quietly, turning back to face him fully. "But you made it about more than that when you invited me to humiliate me. When you attempted to use my attendance as proof of your superiority." She took 3 steps closer to the altar, her gown flowing behind her like water. "You wanted everyone here to see how far you'd climbed. How much better Emily is than what you left behind." She stopped at the base of the altar steps, looking up at Logan and Emily with an expression that held no malice, only clarity. "But I was never beneath you, Logan. I was always exactly who I am now. You just never cared enough to see it." Elias moved to stand beside his sister, his presence a wall of silent authority. The guards maintained their positions along the perimeter, not threatening but absolutely present. Marcus cleared his throat awkwardly. Should we continue the ceremony or?" No one answered him. Emily's hand had dropped from Logan's arm. She stood alone in her white lace gown, looking between Naomi and Logan, and Naomi could see the moment the bride realized that this day, her perfect day, had just been rewritten by forces she'd never anticipated. "I believe," Elias said, his voice carrying easily through the silent ballroom, "we should discuss what happens next. But perhaps not here. Not like this." He gestured toward a side door. An invitation, not a command. But everyone in the room understood it was both. Naomi held Logan's gaze for one more moment. Then she turned, took her brother's offered arm, and walked toward the exit with her head high and her spine straight, every inch the princess she'd always been. Behind them, 300 guests stood in stunned silence, watching royalty leave a wedding that was supposed to be someone else's triumph. For 5 seconds, no one moved. The ballroom had become a tableau of frozen shock. Guests standing, mouths half open, the officiant clutching his Bible like a life raft, Emily's bridesmaids clustered together in matching expressions of horror and fascination. Then Logan's survival instinct kicked in. "Wait." He stepped down from the altar, his hand raised as if he could physically stop what was happening. "Wait, everyone, let's take a breath here." His voice had that forced joviality he used in business meetings when negotiations went sideways. "This is clearly a misunderstanding." "There is no misunderstanding." Elias spoke without turning around, his back still to Logan as he stood beside his sister. The dismissal in that gesture, the refusal to even face Logan directly, cut deeper than any insult could have. Logan's face flushed crimson. "With all due respect, he stumbled over the title, clearly unsure how to address a king. "Sir, this is my wedding. My family's estate. You can't just." Now Elias did turn. The movement was slow, deliberate, and when his eyes met Logan's, the temperature in the room seemed to drop. "I can't." The question hung in the air, deceptively soft. Logan's mouth opened, closed. He'd built his entire adult life on confidence, on the ability to dominate a room through charm and presence. But standing before a man who'd been born to command nations, his power revealed itself as paper-thin. "I didn't mean," Logan started. "What you meant," Elias interrupted, his voice still measured but carrying a weight that made people lean forward to catch every word, "is irrelevant at this moment. What matters is what has already occurred." You invited my sister to this ceremony. You intended for her presence to be a symbol of your triumph over a past relationship. Yes. Logan's jaw worked. Emily grabbed his arm again, her fingers digging in, but he shook her off. It wasn't like that. Then how was it? Naomi asked, speaking for the first time since her brother's entrance. She still hadn't looked directly at Logan. Her eyes swept the crowd instead, marking the society reporters who'd started photographing everything, the guests recording on their phones, the shift in energy as people realized they were witnessing something that would be in headlines by morning. Logan's composure cracked further. Naomi, you're making a scene. No. The word came from Emily. She'd been silent, frozen in her wedding gown like a porcelain doll, but now something inside her snapped. She turned on Logan, her practiced grace evaporating. Don't you dare blame her for making a scene. You did this. You invited your ex to our wedding without telling me she was. Her voice broke. You didn't tell me anything. I didn't know. Logan's voice rose, defensive, almost pleading. How was I supposed to know she was? Exactly. Naomi's voice cut through his excuse with surgical precision. She finally looked at him then, and Logan flinched at what he saw in her eyes. Not anger. Not hurt. Something far worse, indifference. You weren't supposed to know. Because you never asked. You never cared enough to ask. The whispers had evolved from shocked murmurs to something closer to panic. Naomi could hear fragments. International incident. My God, the press. Whitmore family partnering with. Did you get that on camera? Mrs. Whitmore, Logan's mother, moved forward from the front row, her face pale but composed. She'd navigated social disasters before, but this was different. This wasn't a seating chart error or a vendor mishap. This was a sovereign ruler standing in her ballroom, silently judging her son. Your Majesty, she said, addressing Elias with the kind of formal courtesy that came from decades of society training. Perhaps we could speak privately? I'm sure we can resolve this unfortunate. Unfortunate. Elias's eyebrow rose fractionally. I think the unfortunate element, Mrs. Whitmore, is that your son treated my sister as disposable, that he invited her here to parade his supposed superiority. That speaks to character. And character, he paused, letting the word settle, is what the kingdom of Okaforia values most in its partnerships. The shift in conversation made several guests straighten. Partnerships meant business, meant money, meant connections. Logan's father, Arthur Whitmore, stepped forward. Unlike his wife, he'd been watching the entire exchange with the shrewd calculation of a man who'd built an empire through strategic alliances. He understood what was happening here, even if his son didn't. Your Majesty, Arthur said smoothly, we would be honored to discuss any potential collaboration between our families. Would you? Elias's tone remained neutral, but Naomi could feel her brother's strategy unfolding. This was why he'd come. Not just to support her, but to remind everyone in this room that crowns carried weight that wedding rings never could. Elias gestured, and one of the guards stepped forward, handing him a leather portfolio. He opened it with practiced ease. The Kingdom of Okaforia is launching a comprehensive education initiative, Elias announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the ballroom. We are partnering with families and foundations across the Americas and Europe to build schools, fund scholarships, and create opportunities for underserved communities. The investment required is substantial. The commitment required is absolute. He looked directly at Arthur Whitmore now, ignoring Logan entirely. We had considered the Whitmore Foundation as a potential partner. Your philanthropic work has been noted. Your resources are considerable. He paused. But partnerships of this magnitude require more than money. They require aligned values. Integrity. Respect. The implication detonated silently through the crowd. Arthur's face remained neutral, but his eyes flickered to his son, a look that promised a very different conversation later. Emily's composure finally shattered completely. She turned to Logan, her voice a harsh whisper that carried in the unnatural silence. "You didn't tell me she was this. You said she was nobody. You said—" "He didn't know," Naomi repeated, her voice soft but clear. She met Emily's eyes for the first time, and there was something almost sympathetic in her gaze. "He never asked the right questions. About my family. About my background. About who I actually was beneath what he wanted to see." She turned back to the assembled guests, her posture regal, her words deliberate. "I came to America to build my own path, to see if I could be valued for who I was, not what title I carried. Logan gave me an answer to that question." Her eyes found his briefly. "And tonight I'm giving him one in return." Elias closed the portfolio. "We will be in New York for the next week. Should the Whitmore family wish to discuss partnership, my sister will be handling the negotiations." The corner of his mouth lifted almost imperceptibly. "She is, after all, our Minister of International Development. Yale educated. 3 years of diplomatic service. Quite capable." The revelation landed like a series of small explosions. Minister. Yale. Diplomat. Every credential Logan had valued in Emily, Naomi had possessed all along. He'd just never bothered to discover it. Logan stood at the altar in his $1,000 tuxedo, his perfect wedding in ruins, his bride glaring at him, his parents' empire suddenly hanging on the approval of the woman he'd ghosted 8 months ago. And Naomi stood beside her brother, a princess reclaimed, watching Logan finally understand what he'd thrown away. "Shall we?" Elias offered his arm to Naomi. She took it with grace, and together they walked toward the ballroom exit. Not hurrying, not gloating, simply leaving. Behind them, cameras flashed. Guests erupted into chaos. And a wedding that was supposed to celebrate Logan Whitmore's ascension became instead a monument to his spectacular fall. The reception that followed was a masterclass in social collapse. Emily and Logan had proceeded with the ceremony. What else could they do? The officiant had rushed through the remaining vows with visible discomfort, pronouncing them husband and wife to scattered, uncertain applause. They'd walked back down the aisle as a married couple, but the energy had fundamentally changed. The guests weren't watching them anymore. They were watching the exits, checking their phones, whispering about what had just happened. By the time everyone moved to the adjoining ballroom for the reception, the hierarchy had shifted entirely. Naomi and King Elias had taken a table near the center. Not the head table where Logan and Emily sat like abandoned mannequins, but a strategic position that commanded the room. Within minutes, people began gravitating toward them. First the older guests, the ones who understood that proximity to power was everything. Then the diplomats and international business figures who'd been invited for networking. Finally, the press photographers who'd been hired to capture the Whitmore-Davenport union but now sensed a much bigger story. Emily sat at the head table in her wedding gown, watching her reception dissolve around her like sugar in rain. Her smile had become a rictus, frozen and meaningless. Guests approached to offer congratulations, but their eyes kept drifting over her shoulder toward where Naomi held court with effortless grace. "Congratulations," someone said vaguely to Emily, already turning away to crane their neck toward the center table. Emily's hand tightened around her champagne flute until her knuckles went white. Across the table, Logan sat rigid in his chair, watching Naomi with an expression somewhere between fury and disbelief. His mother had disappeared with his father into a side room, crisis management mode. Marcus, his best man, had made himself scarce. The other groomsmen clustered together, whispering and glancing at Logan with something that looked disturbingly like pity. "Logan." The voice came from behind him. Charles Hendricks, one of his father's primary investors, a man whose approval Logan had courted for years. A word. It wasn't a request. Logan stood, adjusting his jacket, and followed Hendricks to a quieter corner of the ballroom. Two other men joined them, both major donors to the Whitmore Foundation, both with the kind of wealth that moved markets. "Is it true?" Hendricks asked without preamble. "The Okaforia partnership?" Logan's throat felt tight. "It's in discussion." "Discussion?" Hendricks's eyes narrowed. "I've spent the last 20 minutes listening to King Elias discuss educational infrastructure investment. Do you have any idea what that kind of partnership could mean? The access to African markets? The diplomatic channels?" "I'm aware." "Are you?" Another investor, Morrison, stepped closer. "Because from where I'm standing, you just humiliated that man's sister at your wedding. So tell me, Logan, is this partnership secure, or did you just blow the biggest opportunity your family's foundation has ever had?" Logan's mind raced. He thought of Naomi's face when she'd revealed her title. The way she'd looked at him, or rather, through him. "I can fix this," he said, forcing confidence into his voice. "I know Naomi. I can talk to her." "You knew her." Morrison interrupted. "From what I just witnessed, you didn't know her at all." The words landed like physical blows. Logan opened his mouth to respond, but Arthur Whitmore appeared at his elbow, his expression carved from stone. "Gentlemen," Arthur said smoothly, "if you'll excuse us. Family matter." The investors exchanged glances but stepped back. Arthur's hand gripped Logan's arm, not gently, and steered him further away. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Arthur's voice was low, controlled, lethal. "Any idea at all?" "Dad, I didn't know." "That's the problem." Arthur's control cracked slightly. "You didn't know because you didn't care to know. And now the entire foundation's future depends on whether a woman you treated as disposable decides to forgive you." Logan wanted to argue to defend himself, but the words wouldn't come. Because his father was right. Across the ballroom, Naomi stood as King Elias extended his hand. The band, which had been playing generic reception music to a largely inattentive audience, shifted into something slower, more elegant. They moved to the dance floor, and the effect was magnetic. Other couples stopped dancing to watch. Cameras flashed. Naomi and her brother moved with the kind of synchronized grace that came from years of formal training, of state dinners and royal functions. A journalist, bold or foolish, approached the edge of the dance floor as the song ended. "Your Highness," she called out. "Princess Naomi, is this about revenge? Coming to your ex's wedding like this?" The room quieted. Everyone wanted to hear the answer. Naomi turned, her expression serene. She considered the question for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice carried clearly. "No," she said softly. "I'm not here for revenge. I'm here for realignment." The journalist's brow furrowed. "Realignment. Revenge suggests I was damaged by what happened. That I need to hurt someone to feel whole again." Naomi's eyes swept the room, landing briefly on Logan before moving on. "But I was never broken. I was only hidden. Tonight is about showing who I've always been. About realigning perception with reality." She smiled, not cruel, not triumphant, just honest. "The rest is consequence." The journalist scribbled furiously. Naomi returned to her table, where diplomats and foundation directors waited to speak with her about educational initiatives, infrastructure projects, partnership opportunities. At the head table, Emily watched it all with growing horror. This was supposed to be her day, her triumph. The moment she finally stepped into the spotlight. But she'd become a shadow in her own wedding, watching another woman command the room with the kind of power that had nothing to do with a white dress or a ring. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "I need air." Logan barely registered her departure. He was too busy watching Naomi, calculating, trying to figure out how to salvage this disaster. Emily found a small anteroom off the main ballroom, a bride's changing room that had been prepared for her but now felt like a prison. She stared at herself in the mirror, at the expensive dress and perfect makeup, and felt tears burning behind her eyes. The door opened. "Logan." "Emily." "Don't." She held up her hand. "Just don't." He closed the door anyway, moving toward her with his hands spread in placation. "Look, this is fixable. I'll talk to Naomi, explain that this was a misunderstanding." Emily laughed. The sound was sharp, bitter, nothing like the refined laughter she'd practiced for years. "A misunderstanding? Logan, you invited your ex-girlfriend to our wedding to humiliate her, and she turned out to be a princess. That's not a misunderstanding. That's karma." "I didn't know." "Of course you didn't know." Emily's voice rose. "Because you never asked. Just like you never really asked about me, did you? You chose me because I fit. Because I looked good on paper. Because my name opens doors." Logan's face flushed. "That's not fair." "Fair." Emily stepped closer, and for the first time, Logan saw real fury in her eyes. Not the polished disappointment of a society bride, but genuine rage. "You used me as a prop in your little revenge fantasy against a woman who was already miles above you. And now," her voice cracked, "now everyone out there knows it. Emily, we can get past this." "This wasn't her humiliation," Emily said, her voice dropping to something cold and final. "It was ours." She turned back to the mirror, straightening her veil with shaking hands. "Your investors want that partnership. Your father's livid. And she laughed again, that same bitter sound. "I just married a man who taught me that I'm as replaceable as the woman he replaced." Logan stood frozen, words failing him. "Get out," Emily whispered. "Go fix your mess. I need a minute before I have to smile for more photos at my ruined wedding." Logan left. The door closed behind him with a soft click, and Emily stared at her reflection, a bride in white, crowned with flowers, married but alone, wondering when exactly her perfect day had become someone else's coronation. Logan found himself in the groom's preparation room, the same room where he'd adjusted his cufflinks hours ago, confident and gleaming. Now his bow tie hung loose around his neck, his jacket discarded over a chair, his shirt partially unbuttoned. He stood before the same mirror, but the man looking back at him seemed unfamiliar. The room was silent except for the muffled sounds of the reception continuing without him. Laughter, music, the clink of glasses, life moving forward while he remained frozen. He'd thought he knew Naomi. That was the thing that kept circling through his mind like a trapped bird. He'd dated her for 8 months, slept beside her, shared meals and conversations and quiet Sunday mornings. He'd thought he understood exactly who she was, a nice woman, pretty enough, grounded, but ultimately not quite right for the life he was building. But standing here now, replaying every interaction through a different lens, Logan realized he'd never known her at all. He remembered their first date, the way she'd laughed at his rehearsed opening line. At the time, he'd thought she was charmed. Now he understood, she'd been amused by his transparency, by how clearly she could see through him. He remembered the night he'd asked about her family, lying in bed, his hand tracing idle patterns on her shoulder. She'd deflected with practiced ease, and he'd let it drop because, he could admit it now, he hadn't actually cared about the answer. He'd asked because it seemed like the thing a good boyfriend should do, not because he wanted to know. What are you, royalty or something? His own words echoed in his memory, half joke, half dismissal. She'd smiled, said nothing, and he'd laughed and moved on to talking about his next business deal. She'd been telling him the truth through her silence, and he'd been too self-absorbed to hear it. Logan gripped the edge of the sink, his knuckles white. He thought of all the moments he'd interpreted as her being impressed by him. His connections, his ambition, his plans. But what if she'd never been impressed? What if she'd been quietly evaluating him and finding him wanting? What if every moment he'd thought he was winning, he'd actually been failing a test he didn't know he was taking? The image that haunted him most was her face at the altar. When she'd stood and announced her title, he'd expected anger, vindication, the rage of a woman scorned. But when her eyes had met his, there'd been none of that. There'd been pity. Not the kind of pity that tears someone down. The kind that simply acknowledges a fundamental lack. She'd looked at him the way someone might look at a child who doesn't yet understand that the world is bigger than they can imagine. And that was somehow worse than hatred could ever be. Logan sank into a chair, his head in his hands. He'd invited her to prove he'd moved on, moved up. But all he'd proven was that he'd never understood what he'd had in the first place. He'd discarded a princess because she hadn't performed royalty for him. He'd ghosted a diplomat because she'd prioritized duty over his ego. He'd failed the most important test of his life by not realizing there was a test at all. The truth hurt. But it hurt quietly like frostbite, numbing before the real pain set in. In the main ballroom, Naomi excused herself from a conversation with a French ambassador and made her way toward the service entrance where catering staff moved in coordinated chaos. She needed a moment away from the diplomatic smiles, the careful conversations, the weight of performance. Near the kitchen entrance, a young black woman, maybe 19 or 20, stood with a tray of empty champagne flutes, staring into the ballroom with an expression Naomi recognized instantly. Wonder mixed with something sharper. Hunger. The look of someone watching a world they desperately wanted to enter but had been taught to believe was locked. The young woman's eyes were fixed on Naomi, or rather on where Naomi had been sitting moments ago. "You work for the catering company?" Naomi asked gently. The girl jumped, nearly dropping her tray. "Oh my God, I'm sorry, Your Highness, I didn't mean to stare, I was just—" She fumbled with the tray, her face flooding with embarrassment. "Breathe," Naomi said, smiling. "What's your name?" "Jasmine." The girl clutched the tray like a shield. "Jasmine Peters." "It's nice to meet you, Jasmine." Naomi leaned against the wall, making herself less intimidating. "You go to school?" Jasmine nodded quickly. "City College. I'm studying business administration. This is just, I work events on weekends to help with tuition." "That's good. That's smart." Naomi paused. "What were you thinking just now, when you were watching?" Jasmine's eyes widened. "I shouldn't. I'm working, I should get back." "The truth," Naomi said softly. "I'd like to hear it." Jasmine hesitated, then something in her posture shifted. Straightened. "I was thinking that I've never seen a black woman be that powerful before. Not in real life." Her voice dropped. "I've seen it in movies or read about it in history books, but not like this. Not walking into a room and making everyone stand up. Making everyone listen." Naomi felt something tighten in her chest. "And what else?" "I was thinking," Jasmine's voice wavered. "I was thinking that maybe if you can do it, maybe there's a version of success I haven't imagined yet. That doesn't require me to make myself smaller or quieter or more acceptable." The words hung in the air between them. Naomi reached into the small clutch she'd carried. Not a purse for vanity but something more practical. She pulled out a business card, simple and elegant, with her direct contact information. "This is my private line," Naomi said, pressing it into Jasmine's free hand. "Call me next week. Tuesday afternoon." Jasmine stared at the card like it might disappear. "I don't understand." "I want to fund your education," Naomi said simply. "Full tuition. And when you graduate, if you're interested, there will be a position waiting for you, either with the Okaforian Ministry of Development or with one of our partner organizations." Tears sprang to Jasmine's eyes. "Why? You don't even know me." "I know enough." Naomi's voice was firm but kind. "I know you're working 2 jobs to put yourself through school. I know you're studying hard despite the obstacles. And I know you're standing here thinking about power and possibility instead of just serving champagne and going home." She stepped closer, her voice dropping to something intimate and fierce. "I spent years hiding who I was because I wanted to be accepted on my own terms. But here's what I learned, Jasmine. Your own terms have to be big enough to hold all of you. Not the diminished version someone else finds comfortable. All of you." Jasmine nodded, unable to speak. "So call me Tuesday." Naomi squeezed her shoulder gently. "And in the meantime, watch how people react tonight. Watch who gravitates toward real power and who just chases the performance of it. That's the first lesson." "What's the lesson?" Jasmine managed. Naomi smiled. "That crowns aren't about gold and jewels. They're about knowing your worth and refusing to negotiate it away for anyone's comfort, even your own." She straightened, preparing to return to the diplomatic circle, but paused. "One more thing. That man up there." She gestured vaguely toward where Logan presumably still was. "He'll try to diminish what happened tonight, to make it about drama or revenge or wounded pride. Don't let anyone tell you that story. What happened tonight was a woman refusing to be erased. Remember that. It matters." Jasmine clutched the business card to her chest. "Thank you. I'll call. I promise." Naomi nodded and returned to the ballroom, where King Elias waited with a raised eyebrow. "Making investments?" he asked quietly. "The best kind," Naomi replied. And across the estate, in a room that smelled of expensive cologne and failure, Logan Whitmore sat alone, finally understanding that some truths hurt quieter than lies, but cut far, far deeper. The reception died slowly, like a fire starved of oxygen. By 9 o'clock, the energy had drained from the ballroom entirely. Guests still moved through the motions, eating cake no one tasted, participating in dances no one watched, making toasts that felt hollow. But everyone understood the evening was already over. The real event had concluded the moment Naomi revealed her crown. Logan and Emily sat at the head table like statues in a museum no one wanted to visit anymore. They barely looked at each other. When they did speak, it was in clipped, necessary words about logistics and timing, about when they could reasonably leave their own reception without it appearing to be the retreat it was. "How much longer?" Emily asked, her voice flat. Logan checked his watch. "Another hour. Maybe less." Good. That was the extent of their conversation as husband and wife. Around them, guests made their excuses. Early morning flights, babysitters, sudden headaches, the usual exit strategies, deployed earlier than protocol typically allowed. But no one wanted to stay. The air felt wrong, like breathing in a room where something had died. Mrs. Whitmore worked the room with forced gaiety, thanking people for coming, insisting everything had been lovely, absolutely lovely. But her smile had a manic quality to it, stretched too tight across her face. Her husband had disappeared entirely, either managing the press situation or having a very different conversation with their lawyers. Near the center table, Naomi stood as King Elias checked his phone. It was time. They'd stayed longer than necessary, not out of obligation to Logan and Emily, but because leaving too early would have looked like running. And royalty didn't run. Royalty made exits. Ready? Elias asked quietly in Yoruba, their mother tongue. Yes, Naomi replied in the same language. They moved toward the ballroom exit, not hurrying but not lingering either. The effect was immediate. Conversations paused. Cameras lifted. The same guests who'd barely noticed their arrival hours ago now tracked their departure like it was a state occasion. Because it was. Marcus, the best man who'd spent the evening drinking heavily in a corner, watched them leave with something like relief. Better they go now, his expression said, before this gets worse. It couldn't get worse. That was the thing Logan and Emily hadn't yet realized. The worst had already happened. Everything else was just aftermath. At the ballroom entrance, a reporter from the society pages, the same one who'd breathlessly covered Emily and Logan's engagement 6 months ago, stepped forward with her photographer. Your Highness, just one photo. But Naomi and Elias walked past without stopping, without even slowing. The guards who'd positioned themselves throughout the evening converged smoothly, creating a moving barrier that was polite but absolute. The cameras flashed anyway, desperate for one more image, one more angle. At the head table, Emily watched them leave. Something inside her cracked further, some last defense of denial. She'd convinced herself that this was just drama, that by tomorrow it would be a funny story about an ex causing a scene. But watching Naomi exit, head high, surrounded by protection, cameras following her like she was the bride, Emily understood with devastating clarity that this wasn't drama. This was displacement. Logan watched too, his jaw tight, his hands clenched on the table. Part of him wanted to call out, to say something, to somehow reclaim control of the narrative. But what could he say? What words existed that could undo what everyone had witnessed? Naomi disappeared through the doorway. The ballroom felt larger without her, emptier, like someone had removed the sun and left only artificial light. I think, Emily said quietly, I'd like to leave now too. Logan nodded. There was nothing left to stay for. Outside, the autumn air was crisp and cold, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and approaching winter. The Whitmore estate's driveway was lined with luxury vehicles waiting for their owners, valets standing at attention, photographers lurking near the gates. A sleek black Mercedes Maybach idled near the entrance, its diplomatic flags barely visible in the evening light. The driver stood at attention as Naomi and Elias approached, opening the rear door with practiced precision. Naomi paused before entering. She turned back toward the mansion, that Georgian monument to old money and older prejudices. Light spilled from every window, warm and golden, illuminating the life happening inside. From here it looked beautiful, timeless, perfect. But Naomi knew better. She'd been inside that perfection. She'd seen how it required people to shrink themselves, to perform acceptable versions of their lives, to trade authenticity for approval. She didn't look at Logan through those windows, didn't search for Emily's white dress or the guests still milling about. She looked at the building itself, the architecture of exclusivity, the walls built to keep certain people out and certain performances in. It was beautiful. It was prison. And she had walked out of it free. Your Highness, the driver prompted gently. Naomi turned back to the car. Elias was already inside, watching her with understanding. He'd made this same choice once, to leave comfort and expectation behind to rule with truth instead of performance. She slid into the car, the door closing with the quiet, expensive sound of German engineering. The leather seats were soft. The interior smelled of luxury and safety. Outside, cameras flashed again, trying for one last shot. The car began to move, pulling away from the mansion with smooth acceleration. Through the tinted windows, Naomi watched the Whitmore estate recede, smaller and smaller until it was just another big house in a landscape full of them. Elias said nothing for a long moment. Then, in Yoruba, "How do you feel?" Naomi considered the question. She waited for anger to arrive, for satisfaction, for triumph, for any of the emotions people probably expected. But what she felt was simpler, quieter, more profound. Relief. "Light," she said finally. "I feel light." Elias nodded, understanding without needing elaboration. "Where to?" the driver asked from the front. "The hotel, Your Majesty." Naomi looked at her brother, at the crown he'd worn tonight, now carefully stored in a protective case beside him, at the weight he carried with such grace, at the choice he'd made to stand beside her when she'd needed him most. She thought of Jasmine, clutching that business card like a lifeline, of the partnerships that would now flow through her office instead of Logan's father's foundation, of the life she'd built in secret that could now finally unfold in sunlight. She thought of Logan, sitting in his honeymoon suite with a wife who would never fully trust him, in a marriage born from performance rather than truth. She didn't hate him. She didn't need to. Karma had already done its work. And she thought of herself, not the hidden version, not the diminished one, but the complete woman she'd always been and could now fully be. "Let's go home," Naomi said simply. The car merged onto the highway, carrying them toward the city, toward the future, toward a life uncompromised. Behind them, the camera flashes faded. The mansion lights grew distant. The hollow celebration continued without them. But the crown, the one Naomi wore invisibly, the one she'd carried in secret, the one she'd finally claimed in full, that crown did not fade. It never had. It never would. Some things, once revealed, cannot be hidden again. And some people, once they stop diminishing themselves, become impossible to ignore. Naomi Carter-Adebayo had arrived at Logan Whitmore's wedding as a ghost from his past. She left as a queen in her own right. And that made all the difference. The end.
Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one. Don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.